The gravel cracked beneath his boots as he stepped onto the private training field. His shirt, beige, wrinkled, a bit too large at the sleeves, moved gently with the wind. He didn't carry much, just an old, scuffed rifle case and a thermos. That smelled faintly of black coffee and worn leather. Around him everything gleamed. Steel rifles, polished boots, name tags that sparkled under the sun. The elite had gathered, former spec ops, tactical instructors, and officers with more ribbons than memories. They talked loud, laughed louder, and moved like they owned every inch of the air. Then came the silence. Major Kyle Redford spotted him first. His jaw tightened. "Hey!" he barked, eyes narrowing. "This area's for competitors. Observers, stay behind the line." David didn't move. He offered a small nod and extended his registration form. Kyle glanced at the form, then at the man, then back to the form, and chuckled. "You're kidding. This isn't open mic night for weekend warriors." A few of the others snickered. One muttered, "Where'd this guy crawl in from, a flea market?" David said nothing, just stood there, case in hand, eyes clear. "You want to watch?" Kyle continued. "Fine, but don't embarrass yourself pretending you belong here." Then, without warning, he took the form and ripped it in half, tossed it in the dirt. "Try the community fair down the road. They might let you throw beanbags." Laughter broke out around him, a cruel, echoing kind of laughter that's louder than any insult. David looked down at the torn paper, paused, picked it up, slowly, carefully, and folded it in half again, as if it still mattered. He turned, stepped back to the sideline, and sat down on a worn wooden bench beside the equipment trailer. He didn't glare, didn't fume. He just unscrewed his thermos, took a quiet sip, and watched the others like he was studying a painting. Not because it was beautiful, but because it revealed something. That moment, quiet, still, almost forgettable, held more weight than anyone there realized, because the truth wasn't in what he said, it was in what he didn't need to say. And the next day, they'd all learned just how wrong they'd been. His name was David Carter, and he had learned early that strength rarely looks the way people expect. He wasn't raised in prestige, no silver spoon, no famous last name, just long summers fixing. Tractors in his uncle's barn, winters splitting firewood with hands that would one day pull wounded soldiers from burning wreckage. Before the titles, before the missions, before anyone cared who he was, David had already survived more than most. He entered the military at 19, a quiet kid with sharp eyes and a posture that spoke of discipline long before the uniform. What no one expected was how fast he adapted, how calm he stayed under pressure, how he never needed to be told twice. By 22, he had completed Ranger School, one of the youngest in his unit. But David never boasted. When others wore their accomplishments like armor, he wore his like shadows, present but never paraded. What earned him true respect wasn't his aim, though it was lethal. It was his decisions, tactical brilliance in impossible moments, choosing silence when others screamed, protecting civilians before glory, saving lives with no one watching. There was one mission deep in Coast Province where everything unraveled, his team trapped, communications dead. The plan had failed. The commanding officer was injured. The extraction point compromised. David recalculated in seconds. He carried 2 men across 5 kilometers of unstable ground, set up a makeshift perimeter, radioed coordinates with a cracked transmitter, and refused to evacuate until the last man was airborne. He stayed behind, walked out alone, but the real story never made it beyond a sealed file. After his discharge, honorable, decorated but emotionally fractured, he didn't return to a parade. He returned to a town where people didn't ask about medals, a place where silence wasn't suspicious. He bought a cabin with no Wi-Fi, fixed his own roof, and started teaching survival skills to kids with nothing but questions. There was one student, Eli Vargas, a 14-year-old with a stutter and no father. David saw something in him, a fire hidden under hesitation. He taught Eli how to light a fire with wet wood, how to tie a secure knot with one hand, how to hold a knife not like a weapon but like a tool. And one day after practice, Eli said quietly, "You never yell, even when I mess up." "Why?" David looked at him and replied, "Because someone once taught me that yelling's for people who don't know how to listen." That's who David was, not a hero, a reminder, but even reminders have doubts. When the invitation to the elite shooting competition arrived, unsigned, simple, almost cryptic, he stared at it for hours. He didn't want attention, didn't need validation. So why couldn't he throw it away? The night before the event, he cleaned his rifle in silence, the same way he used to clean it before combat, not with urgency but with reverence. He packed light, folded his beige shirt, left a note on the shelter's bulletin board. Gone for a couple days, don't burn the place down unless it's for marshmallows. He drove through the fog, past gas stations and forgotten diners, toward a place that would soon remember his name, not because he wanted it, but because it was time. The sun was barely up when David arrived. The compound loomed behind a security gate lined with flags and a sharp metallic buzz of authority. Every movement inside was precise. Men running drills, orders shouted with clipped tones, boots slamming pavement like punctuation. He parked in the furthest lot, not out of shame, out of habit. David liked space. He liked silence. He liked being the man no one noticed, until they had to. As he walked toward the entrance, he passed a group of recruits lining up near the armory. One of them glanced at him, then nudged the other, smirking. He looks like someone's uncle. Showed up to pick up laundry. David caught it, didn't flinch. Instead, he watched the recruit fumble while loading his magazine. Too much tension in the hands. Breath too shallow. Training would fix it. Maybe. Maybe not. At check-in, the clerk looked confused when David handed over the second replacement copy of his registration form, the one he'd printed at a gas station after Kyle shredded the first. The name triggered something on the screen. A pause, a blink, then the clerk sat up straighter. "Mr. Carter, you've been cleared. Special override. Sorry for the, inconvenience." David nodded once. No harm. He moved past the entry point like a man entering a past he thought he buried. Inside the prep zone, the competitors buzzed with nervous energy, testing scopes, comparing gear, stretching fingers like musicians before a symphony. Their uniforms were tailored, their weapons pristine. David's rifle looked like it had stories because it did. He found a corner near the shade of a rusted generator, placed his case down, sat on an overturned crate, began cleaning each part slowly, methodically, with a rhythm that felt more like ritual than routine. He didn't speak, didn't engage, didn't correct the ones who whispered about him. Not even when someone said, "He's just here to make the real shooters look good," because David wasn't there for them. He was there for something he hadn't even admitted to himself yet. Maybe it was closure. Maybe it was a quiet rage he'd never let out. Or maybe it was for the kid inside him, the one who once fixed his uncle's tractor with fishing wire and a prayer, and still wondered if being good ever mattered in a world that only applauds loud. Then it began. The first round. Target transitions. Timed movements. Precision at distance. David watched from the side, measured everything. When his turn was called, a murmur spread. Not curiosity, not interest. Just that strange tension that fills a room when no one expects anything. He stepped forward, set his rifle down, adjusted his stance. The timer beeped, and he moved. Not fast, but fluid. Every shot deliberate. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The type of movement that's born from repetition in dust and blood, not theory. By the time he finished, the timer still had a second left. He walked off without checking the board, sat back, on his crate, and drank from his thermos like nothing had happened. But everyone was watching now, not because he was flashy, but because something about him unsettled them. A calm too still to be ordinary, a confidence too quiet to be fake. And somewhere, deep inside those watching eyes, the first ripple of doubt began. Who is this man? He didn't win the round, at least not officially. Some younger competitor clocked in 0.2 of a second faster, let off more rounds, celebrated louder. But David's score was clean. No penalties, no wasted movement, just precision. One of the E. Judges, a man with a slow limp and a tired expression, watched the footage on loop. Rewind, play, pause, zoom. His brow furrowed deeper with each frame. "He's not just trained," the judge muttered to another. "He's lived it." Word spread quietly. Not in the crowd, not in the public scoreboard, but in glances, nods, that unspoken shift in body language when confidence turns into concern. Because what if the man in the beige shirt wasn't a joke? What if he was a mirror? By the second trial, David was on the A range, this time moving targets, shooting uphill, adjusting for wind and recoil. Most shooters missed one, sometimes two. David missed none, and he didn't celebrate, didn't even look at the screen. He simply broke down his rifle, cleaned the bolt with a piece of cloth tucked in his pocket, and waited. The silence around him grew heavier. Kyle noticed it. He watched from the upper platform, arms crossed, trying to mask the discomfort growing in his chest. It wasn't just that David was performing well. It was the way he did it. No adrenaline, no showmanship, just control. Kyle stepped closer to the edge, squinting. That face, that posture, something about it scratched at memory. Then after the third trial, as a judge finally said it aloud, "I know that man." Everyone stopped. The judge stepped onto the field, holding an old laminated photo, yellowed edges, creased down the middle. He held it next to David without asking, "You're Carter. You're from Hellman, 2008. David looked up slowly. Didn't answer, didn't need to. The judge turned to the other officials. He was the one. Saved an entire unit, refused extraction until every wounded man was safe, crawled back to base with shrapnel. In his side, someone gasped. Someone else lowered their rifle. Kyle turned to stone. His eyes didn't blink, because he remembered that mission. Not the details, but the rumor of a nameless operator who'd done the impossible and disappeared. And now the man he called Rookie was a legend. But David, he just stood adjusting the strap on his case like none of it mattered, because to him, it didn't. That evening, the compound was quieter than usual. The drills had ended. The laughter was gone. And yet, David stayed, behind alone in the locker room, sitting on a cold bench with the same case at his feet. The echo of the judge's words still hung in the air, not because they were wrong, but because they touched something he'd buried deep, something raw. He opened his case not to clean the rifle, but to touch it. His fingers brushed over the grip like it was an old friend who never stopped showing up no matter how far he tried to walk away. On the wall across from him, a cracked mirror. He looked at it not to fix his collar, not to study his reflection, but to search for the part of him that still questioned everything. Was staying quiet the right thing? Would speaking up have changed anything? Would they have respected me, or just resented me sooner? He thought of the young men who laughed when he walked in. He thought of the clerk who apologized without ever making eye contact. He thought of Kyle, and the way the major's face had crumpled just for a second when the truth hit him like recoil. And David felt tired, not physically, existentially. Like every second of patience he'd spent over the years had just come due all at once. Because the truth wasn't that he wanted validation. It was that he wondered, in his most human moments, if kindness and humility were still worth it in a world that rewarded noise, posture, and spectacle. He remembered a mission from years back, in a village outside Jalalabad. A mother had placed her baby in his arms during a raid evacuation. She didn't speak his language, but her eyes begged him to get the child out alive. He did. Didn't tell anyone, didn't file it, just carried that moment home with him, along with the shrapnel, and the nightmares, and the silence. He told himself back then, "This is why I do it. Not for thanks, for peace." But now, sitting on a bench where no one else remained, he wondered, had that peace ever come? A door creaked open behind him. One of the recruits, the same one who mocked his clothes, stood there holding a canteen and a hesitant expression. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, eyes low. David nodded, said nothing. The boy lingered, then added, "It's not just that you were right, it's that you were kind, and I think that's harder." David looked up at him and for the first time that day, smiled, barely, but it was real. "Kindness isn't hard," he said quietly. "Staying kind. When it's not returned, that's the part they don't teach." The recruit left, and David sat there a while longer, not alone, but changed. The next morning, David arrived early again. Same shirt, same rifle case, same quiet stride that made louder men uncomfortable. But something had shifted. This time, when he walked past the prep zone, heads turned with intention. No smirks, no whispers, just silence, the kind reserved for people who've earned something bigger than applause. He wasn't on the schedule anymore. His last event had ended the day before, but still, he came. Maybe out of habit, maybe to make sure no one left with the wrong idea. At the far end of the range, Kyle stood with a clipboard, though it looked more like a shield now than a tool. His posture was stiff, almost rehearsed, as if he were preparing for a confrontation he'd already lost. David didn't approach. He didn't need to. It was Kyle who moved first, crossing the field slower than usual, hands empty, no bark, no bravado. When he stopped in front of David, the air held still between them. Then quietly, barely above a whisper, Kyle said, "I was wrong. It wasn't rehearsed and it wasn't complete, but it was enough. David nodded, slow, not in approval, just in acknowledgement. Kyle cleared his throat. The things they said about you, the missions, the rescue, that was real? David looked at him, and for once Kyle didn't flinch under the gaze. I don't need you to believe it, David replied. I need you to believe the next man who walks in wearing what I wore. Kyle looked down, ashamed, and that was justice. Not the kind written in reports, but the kind that breaks ego into something softer. Later that day, a judge approached David with an unusual request. We're training a new class, recruits from non-traditional backgrounds, first generation, soldiers, kids who weren't born into this world. We'd like you to speak. David hesitated. He wasn't a speaker. He wasn't even comfortable with titles anymore, but something about the request and the timing felt like a full circle. So, he agreed. He stood before 30 recruits that afternoon, under a sun that pressed hard against his shoulders. Most of them had never heard his name. A few looked confused, some looked skeptical. David cleared his throat, looked them in the eyes, and said, "You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't have to be known to be right. And if you're ever judged for how you look, make sure you're ready when it's time to show who you really are." No applause followed, just a silence heavy with understanding. Then a single clap, then another, then all of them, standing, not because they were told to, but because they saw what the others had missed and knew now not to make the same mistake. In the days that followed, something strange happened on the range. People started talking less, not in a cold way, in a measured one. There were fewer jokes about appearances, fewer assumptions made at first glance. New recruits were greeted with more patience. Veterans began staying after drills, asking questions they once thought beneath them. And David, he kept showing up, not every day, but just enough. Sometimes he brought extra gloves, sometimes a thermos with enough coffee for two. Once he showed a kid how to brace his elbow using a rolled-up sock, a trick he learned on a frozen mountainside in '09, where a fractured arm couldn't be an excuse to miss. Kyle watched from a distance, still stiff, still figuring out how to wear humility. But he was watching. One afternoon, as drills wrapped up, Kyle walked over. No crowd, no performance. Just two men and a bench. He sat beside David and handed him a small envelope. "Don't open it now," Kyle said. "Just when you're ready." David placed it in his shirt pocket without a word. They sat there in silence for a while. Two men who'd once stood on opposite ends of a spectrum, neither of them fully understood. Before leaving, Kyle added quietly, "I've spent a lot of years talking. Might try listening for a change." David didn't nod, didn't smile, but something in his stillness said more than a handshake ever could. That night, back in his cabin, David opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, no signature, no apology, just a single sentence written in block letters. "I used to think the uniform made the man. You made me realize it's the other way around." He folded it gently and slid it between the pages of an old field manual, one he hadn't opened in years but never had the heart to throw away. He thought of Eli, of the recruits, of the cracked mirror in the locker room and the words he told himself when he doubted everything. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace, not because the world had changed, but because someone had, and that was enough for now. Not all victories are loud. Some are quiet, like the sound of a man walking away from applause because he never needed it in the first place. David Carter didn't change lives with speeches or medals. He didn't stand taller to prove a point. He didn't argue when humiliated or defend himself when mocked. He just lived, and with intention, and that was louder than anything else, because what his story teaches us isn't just about respect, it's about recognition, that there are people walking among us who have carried more than we'll ever know, people who choose humility, not because they lack power, but because they understand it. David was never looking for redemption. He wasn't broken, he was built differently. He stood as proof that character doesn't come from rank, it comes from choice, that the strongest man in the room might be the one who says nothing, helps quietly and leaves without waiting to be thanked, and that the most dangerous mistake we can make is to confuse simplicity with insignificance. So next time you see someone standing quietly in the background, wearing old clothes, saying less than others, not demanding attention, look again, because the person you ignore might be the reason someone else is still standing, and their story might be the one that saves yours.